The water bucket slipped from Jacob Mercer's hands the moment he saw her on the horizon, and for the first time in 8 years, the war came flooding back. Not the war everyone talked about, the one with battles and generals and glory, but the other war, the one that happened in the spaces between, where men made choices that carved pieces from their souls and left them hollow. She was impossible. That was his first thought. 7 feet of impossibility moving across the West Texas scrubland like something out of a fever dream. Her shadow stretching long in the afternoon sun of August 1866. Jacob stood frozen at his camp, one hand still outstretched toward the fallen bucket, watching her approach with the slow inevitability of a thunderstorm rolling across the plains. He'd chosen this life, specifically to avoid moments like this. After Appomattox, after the surrender, after watching everything he'd fought for turn to ash and blood, Jacob had ridden west until the land itself seemed to give up on civilization. Here, 40 miles south of the New Mexico border, in a stretch of Texas so remote that even the Comanche rarely bothered with it, he'd built his camp. Not a home. Never a home. Just a camp where a man could work cattle that weren't his, sleep under stars that asked no questions, and wake up without having to remember who he used to be. The woman, if she could still be called merely a woman, kept coming. Jacob could see now that she was black, her skin dark as the river stones he'd collected for his fire pit, and she moved with the mechanical persistence of someone who'd forgotten how to stop. Her dress, what remained of it, hung in ribbons that did almost nothing to preserve modesty. Her feet were bare, leaving dark prints in the dust, and even from 200 yards away, Jacob could see that those prints weren't just dirt. They were blood. His hand moved instinctively to the Navy Colt at his hip, then stopped. Old habits. Old wars. He forced his hand away from the gun and picked up the water bucket instead, drawing fresh from the well he'd dug 3 months ago, when he'd first claimed this patch of nothing as his temporary refuge. She stopped at the edge of his camp, swaying like a tree in strong wind. Up close, she was even more impossible. Jacob had served with men who stood 6.5 feet tall, giants in the infantry who towered over their fellows. This woman made them look ordinary. Her eyes, when they met his, carried something that made his stomach clench. Not fear, not defiance. Something worse, emptiness. "Water," she said, and her voice was surprisingly soft, almost gentle, like she was asking for something she had no right to expect, but couldn't help requesting anyway. Jacob held out the bucket. She didn't take it immediately. Instead, she studied him with an intensity that felt like being dissected, like she was reading every choice he'd ever made and finding them all catalogued in the lines of his face. He was 31 years old and looked 50. The war had done that. The things after the war had finished the job. "It's clean," he said quietly. Just pulled it up. She took the bucket with hands that dwarfed his own, and he noticed the scars. Old scars, new scars, scars upon scars, a topography of suffering mapped across her fingers and palms. She drank like someone who'd forgotten what water tasted like. Long pulls that made her throat work visibly, emptying the bucket in seconds. "More," she said, not quite a question, not quite a demand. Jacob pulled up 3 more buckets. She drank them all. When she finally stopped, she stood straighter, and he realized with cold certainty that she could probably break him in half without much effort. The thought should have frightened him. Instead, it just made him tired. "You're running," he said. Not a question. "Was running," she corrected. "Now I'm here. Here's not good. Here's nothing. Here's where I came to be left alone. Here's where I stopped," she said simply. Feet wouldn't go no further. Body said enough, so here I stopped. Jacob looked past her, scanning the horizon. Nothing yet, but that would change. You didn't get a woman this size, this distinctive, running through Texas without someone coming to look. The war had ended slavery, supposedly. But Jacob had seen enough of Reconstruction to know that laws written in Washington meant nothing out here in the territories where men still settle things the old way. How long you been running? 6 weeks. Maybe 7. Lost count after the river. How many following you? She smiled, and it was the saddest expression Jacob had ever seen. Everyone. Everyone who can get away. They follow because I'm easy to spot, easy to track to. They think I know where I'm going. She paused. I don't? You alone? Was probably not anymore. The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and Jacob felt something shift in his chest, some old instinct from the war trying to reassert itself. The instinct that had kept him alive through Shiloh and Gettysburg and a dozen smaller horrors, whose names he'd deliberately forgotten. You need to keep moving, he said. Before dark. They track better in daylight. Can't, she said simply. Feet done. Body done. Mind almost done. This is where I stop, whether they come or not. Jacob wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the reasons why stopping here was suicide, but he'd heard that tone before. In field hospitals, in prisoner camps, in the eyes of men who'd marched until there was nothing left but the marching. She'd reached her limit, and limits weren't negotiable. What's your name? He asked instead. Had a name on the plantation, Sarah May, but the woman who bore me called me Zara before they sold her. I like Zara better. It's mine, not theirs. Jacob Mercer. You fight in the war, Jacob Mercer? Yeah. Which side? He paused, weighing the truth against comfort, and chose truth. The wrong one. She laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking. At least you know it now. Some men die still believing. The sun was dropping toward the horizon when Jacob saw them. Not riders. People on foot, moving slowly across the scrubland like an army of ghosts. He counted frantically, losing track, starting over. 50. 100. More. They kept coming. Emerging from draws and arroyos, like the land itself was giving birth to them. By the time the sun touched the horizon, Jacob's camp was surrounded by 250 souls, maybe more. Men, women, children, all of them black, all of them dressed in the tatters of bondage, or whatever they'd managed to steal during their flight. They formed a loose circle around his camp, just standing there, silent as tombstones, watching him with eyes that held everything from hope to hatred. Zara stood in the center of the circle, towering above everyone else, and when she raised one arm and pointed at Jacob's camp, the gesture carried the weight of prophecy. This is where we stop, she said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. This man gave me water when he could have shot me. That tells me something. Maybe it tells you something too. Jacob looked at the faces surrounding him, at the children clinging to their mothers' skirts, at the old men leaning on walking sticks, at the young men with murder in their eyes and nowhere left to run to. He saw himself reflected in their desperation, saw the same trapped feeling he'd carried since Appomattox, when he'd realized that everything he'd fought for had been a lie built on the backs of people exactly like these. I can't help you, he said, hearing the weakness in his own voice. I'm nobody. I've got nothing. This isn't even my land, just public range I'm squatting on. We're not asking you to save us, an old woman said, stepping forward from the crowd. Her face carried scars that looked like someone had written on her skin with a hot iron. We're asking you to let us be here while we figure out what comes next. What comes next is men with guns and dogs. Jacob said, what comes next is everyone here getting caught, and me getting hanged for harboring you. That's what comes next. Then you should probably ride out now, a young man said, his voice hard as river rock. Because we're staying whether you like it or not. We're done running. We stop here. The terrible thing was, Jacob understood. He'd reached his own stopping point a year ago, in a burned-out plantation house in Georgia, where he'd found things that still visited his dreams. He'd walked away from everything that day, his unit, his uniform, his name for a while. Just walked away because some things broke you in ways that couldn't be fixed. These people had reached their breaking point too, and breaking points weren't subject to logic or negotiation. He could ride out. Should ride out. Let them figure out their own ending while he found another empty stretch of nowhere to disappear into. But he stood there, looking at Zara's face, at the trust in her eyes that he absolutely did not deserve, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, responsibility. There's caves, he heard himself say, about 2 miles south, along the canyon where the river cuts through. Deep ones, cool in summer. I've been storing supplies there. If you're careful, if you're quiet, you could hide there for a while. How long's a while? The old woman asked. I don't know, Jacob admitted. Long enough to rest, maybe. Long enough to plan something better than just standing in the open waiting to be caught. Zara's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. Relief, maybe, or just the absence of immediate terror. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Jacob replied. Thank me if we're all still alive in 3 days. As darkness fell and 250 people began moving toward the caves he'd mentioned, Jacob stood alone at his camp and tried to calculate how many laws he'd just broken, how many years in prison he was looking at, how many ways this could end in blood and fire. He'd ridden west to escape choices. Instead, he'd found the hardest choice of all, and somewhere in the darkness behind him, he could hear children crying, and it sounded exactly like every battlefield he'd ever tried to forget. Asterisk. The caves were a network of limestone chambers carved by an ancient river that had changed course generations ago. Jacob had discovered them 2 months into his time here, while tracking a wounded steer that had wandered off from the herd he was supposed to be watching. The steer had died in the deepest chamber, and Jacob had spent 3 days dragging the carcass out, then another week exploring the full extent of the caverns. Now, as he led 250 people through the darkness with nothing but moonlight and a few precious candles, he realized he'd been preparing for this without knowing it. Every supply he'd stored here, every cached water barrel, every hidden entrance he'd mapped, it was like some part of him had known. This moment was coming. Zara moved through the caves with surprising grace for someone her size, her head barely clearing the lower passages. She organized the refugees with quiet efficiency, placing families in the larger chambers, posting guards at the entrances, establishing rules about noise and movement that everyone seemed to accept without question. You've done this before, Jacob observed as they worked. Lid people? No. Been responsible for keeping people alive while men with guns looked for us? She paused. Every day since I was old enough to understand what being property meant. By dawn, the caves held all 250 souls, packed in tightly but hidden from casual observation. Jacob returned to his camp alone, his mind already racing through the problems ahead. Food, water, sanitation, security. Every problem had a dozen complications, and every complication could get everyone killed. He was building up his fire, trying to make the camp look normal and occupied, when he heard hoofbeats. 3 riders coming from the east, moving fast. Jacob forced himself to keep working, to not react, to look like a man with nothing to hide. The leader was a thick-set man with a marshal's badge and eyes like chips of flint. The other 2 looked like hired guns, the kind of men who'd found work in the chaos after the war and decided they liked the taste of it. Morning, the marshal said, not dismounting. Name's Cutler, federal marshal out of Fort Stockton. You the man working Henderson's cattle? That's me, Jacob Mercer. See any colored folks come through here? Large group, maybe 50 or so? 50. They were underestimating by a factor of 5. That meant the various escapes hadn't been connected yet, hadn't been counted as one mass exodus. Haven't seen anyone, Jacob said evenly. Pretty isolated out here. That's what makes it perfect for hiding, one of the hired guns said. Young, maybe 23, with a Confederate cavalry pin still on his hat. Empty country, no law. Man could hide a whole army out here if he wanted. Could, Jacob agreed. But why would I? I've got nothing to do with anyone else's problems. I came out here specifically to avoid other people. Cutler studied him with uncomfortable intensity. You serve? Did my time? Which side? The one that lost? Something shifted in Cutler's expression. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. Two men who'd worn gray facing each other in a world that had moved on without asking their permission. Then you understand property law, Cutler said quietly. You understand that the 13th Amendment didn't apply retroactively to slaves who escaped before ratification. You understand that there's a legal gray area here, and some owners are still pursuing their property through the courts. I understand that you're chasing people, Jacob said. What the law says about it doesn't change what it is. Careful, Cutler warned. That kind of talk could get you charged as an accessory. To what? I already told you I haven't seen anyone. The young gun walked his horse in a slow circle around Jacob's camp, eyes scanning for evidence. Jacob had spent the night clearing away any signs of the refugees' presence, but 250 people left traces. Boot prints. Disturbed ground. The simple mathematical impossibility of one man using supplies meant for one man. Your fire pit's too big, the young gun said suddenly. Too much ash for one man cooking for himself. Had some drovers through last week, Jacob lied smoothly. Henderson sent them to check on me, make sure I wasn't stealing his cattle. They stayed 2 nights. That true? Cutler asked. You can ride to Henderson's ranch and ask him yourself. It's only 60 miles. The sarcasm hung in the air. Cutler's eyes narrowed, but he didn't push it. Instead, he pulled out a piece of paper, unfolded it, and held it so Jacob could see it was a sketch. A crude but effective drawing of a woman. An impossibly tall woman. This one's special, Cutler said. 7 feet tall, maybe more. Escaped from a breeding farm in Louisiana 6 months ago. Killed 2 overseers and a handler during her escape. There's a $1,000 reward for her return. Dead or alive, though her owner prefers alive. She's valuable property. Jacob looked at the sketch, at the artist's attempt to capture Zara's face, and felt rage building in his chest like steam in a kettle. Breeding farm. They'd reduced her to livestock, to an animal whose only value was producing more property. Haven't seen her, he said, keeping his voice level through sheer force of will. If you do, there's money in it for you. Good money. Enough to buy your own spread instead of working someone else's cattle. I'll keep that in mind. Cutler stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. We're going to sweep this area thoroughly. If you're hiding anything, we'll find it. And if we do, you'll hang right alongside them. That clear? Crystal. They rode off south, away from the caves, which bought Jacob some time, but not much. He watched them disappear over the horizon, then walked quickly to the cave's hidden entrance. Zara met him in the first chamber. Somehow she'd heard the conversation, or maybe she just read it in his face. They're looking specifically for you, Jacob said. $1,000. They called you property from a breeding farm. Her expression didn't change, but her hands curled into fists. The Dalacroix plantation. Outside Baton Rouge, they bred us like horses. Big women to big men, trying to create a line of oversized slaves, they could sell for premium prices. My mother was 6'3". My father was 6'7". They bought him special, just for her, Jesus Christ. He died when I was 10, worked to death in the cane fields. His heart couldn't keep up with his body size. My mother went mad after that, started talking to people who weren't there, laughing at nothing. They sold her to a medical college for experimentation. I was 14. Jacob had seen horrors in the war, had participated in some, if he was honest with himself. But this was different. This was systematic, industrial-scale cruelty, and it made everything he'd fought for feel even more obscene. "The overseers you killed," he said, "were they trying to stop you?" One was. The other two. She paused, and something dark moved behind her eyes. The other two were in my quarters, doing what they'd done before, what they thought they had the right to do, because I was property, and property doesn't say no. The words hung in the air between them, and Jacob understood with terrible clarity why she'd reached her stopping point here, why she couldn't run anymore. You could only carry so much horror before your legs gave out from the weight. "How many of these people know about the bounty on you?" He asked. "Most of them." I told them at the start. Told them following me was dangerous, that I drew attention, that staying with me meant higher risk. They came anyway. Why? Because I was the only one willing to walk in front. Because someone has to be first, even when first means being the target. Over the next 3 days, Jacob fell into a routine that would have been almost domestic if it weren't built on terror. He'd ride his normal rounds, checking on Henderson's cattle, making sure everything looked normal to any observer. Then he'd return to camp, wait until dark, and bring supplies to the caves. Food was the critical problem. His stores were running out fast, and 250 people needed more than jerky and HARDTACK. The refugees organized themselves with impressive efficiency. The old woman with the scarred face, who introduced herself as Mama Ezekiel, established cooking rotations and rationing systems. A man named Thomas, who'd been a carpenter before his escape, reinforced the cave structures and created hidden compartments for the most vulnerable. A teenage girl named Ruth taught the children games they could play silently, using hand signals and careful movements that wouldn't echo through the limestone chambers. But it was the stories that haunted Jacob. Every person had one, and in the close darkness of the caves, people spoke truths they might not have shared in daylight. Thomas had been sold away from his wife and 3 children when his owner needed money to pay gambling debts. He'd spent 5 years saving every penny from the extra work he was allowed to do on Sundays. Finally bought his freedom legally, then walked 300 miles back to the plantation where his family lived, only to discover they'd been sold south 2 years earlier. "I didn't run for freedom," he said quietly. "I ran because staying in a world that legal meant I'd already given up on ever seeing them again." Mama Ezekiel had been enslaved for 67 years. She'd had 12 children. All of them had been sold away before their 10th birthdays. "I don't even know if any of them are still alive," she said. "But I couldn't die property. I had to die free, even if free only meant 1 day, 1 hour. Even if free meant dying in a cave in Texas." Ruth, the teenage girl, had scars on her back that looked like someone had used her for riding practice with a whip. "My master's son," she said simply. He was learning scripture. Every time he made a mistake copying verses, he'd practice his penmanship on my back. By the time I ran, I had most of Deuteronomy carved into my skin. Jacob listened to these stories and felt something breaking inside him, some last defense he'd built against the world's cruelty. He'd told himself during the war that he was fighting for states' rights, for sovereignty, for a way of life. But that way of life had been built on this, on Thomas's stolen family, on Mama Ezekiel's 12 children sold like furniture. On Ruth's back, used as a teaching tool. On Zerah, bred like livestock in service of profit. On the fourth night, as he was bringing water to the caves, Jacob found Zerah standing alone at the deepest chamber entrance, staring into darkness so complete it seemed to have texture. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Don't sleep much anymore. Sleeping means dreaming. Dreaming means going back. I know that feeling." She looked at him, really looked at him, and he felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the darkness. "What did you do in the war that haunts you, Jacob Mercer?" He'd never told anyone. Not fully. Not the parts that woke him up screaming. But something about this woman, this impossible woman who'd been broken and refused to stay broken, made him want to confess. "We burned a plantation in Georgia. Late in the war, when everything was falling apart and everyone knew we'd lost. The owner had fled, but the slaves were still there. About 40 of them. They were celebrating, thinking they were free now that we'd arrived." He paused, the memory crawling up his throat like broken glass. "My captain wanted to burn everything. Scorched earth. Send the message. I argued with him, said the slaves needed the buildings, needed the supplies. He said slaves weren't our concern, that they'd figure it out or they wouldn't, but our job was destruction." "You followed orders," Zerah said softly. "Worse, I helped. I told myself I was just a soldier, just following orders, that it wasn't my responsibility what happened after. We burned it all. The main house, the slave quarters, the barns full of winter supplies. And then we rode away, and I could hear them behind us, crying, begging us to stop because we'd just destroyed everything they needed to survive the winter that was coming. Did they survive? I don't know. I never went back to check. Never had the courage to find out if my obedience to orders had killed 40 people who'd done nothing but celebrate too early." Zerah was quiet for a long time. Then, "You're trying to balance the scales now. Save 250 to make up for maybe killing 40. Maybe. Mathematics doesn't work like that. Salvation isn't arithmetic. You can't subtract evil by adding good. Then why am I doing this? Because it's the only thing you can do that lets you sleep at night. Because you're human, and humans need to believe they can change, can be better than they were yesterday." She paused. "Because 40 people in Georgia needed help you didn't give them, and 250 people in Texas need help you can." Before Jacob could respond, a sound echoed through the caves. A dove call, specific and unmistakable. The signal they'd established for danger approaching. Riders coming fast. And this time, there were a lot of them. Jacob ran toward the cave entrance with Zerah right behind him, her long strides eating up ground twice as fast as his. By the time they reached the lookout position Thomas had established on the canyon rim, they could see the dust cloud approaching from the northeast. Not 3 riders. Not a dozen. At least 40, maybe more, moving in a coordinated sweep pattern that spoke of military training. "That's not a search party," Thomas said quietly from his position behind a rock outcropping. "That's an army." Jacob pulled out the battered spyglass he'd carried since the war, focusing on the lead riders. What he saw made his blood run cold. Cutler was there, but he wasn't leading anymore. At the front rode a man in an immaculate gray uniform, modified from Confederate cavalry dress, sitting his horse like he owned every inch of ground beneath it. "Colonel Vance?" Jacob breathed. "You know him?" Zerah asked. "Everyone who fought in the West knows him. Wade Vance. He was a cavalry officer, the kind who made Sherman look merciful. After the war, he went into the slave-hunting business, built it into an industry. They say he's captured more runaways than any 10 men combined. And now he's here," Thomas said flatly. "For us." Jacob watched through the spyglass as Vance raised his hand, and the riders spread out in a pattern that would sweep the entire area in a matter of hours. These weren't random bounty hunters. This was a coordinated military operation, and Vance was treating it exactly like a campaign. "We need to move," Jacob said. "Now, scatter into smaller groups, head in different directions. Maybe some of you can slip through the gaps in their sweep. And abandon the children?" Mama Ezekiel had climbed up to join them, moving with surprising speed for her age. "Abandon the pregnant women, the sick, the old? We split up now. The strong might escape, but the weak will be caught within hours. If you stay together, everyone gets caught," Jacob argued. "Then we make them work for it," a voice said from below. A young man climbed up to join them, someone Jacob had noticed before, but never spoken to. He was maybe 25, with burn scars covering half his face and murder in his eyes. "My name's Silas. I worked the Granger plantation in Mississippi until I killed my overseer with a shovel and ran. I've got nothing to lose and everything to hate. So here's what I'm proposing. Some of us stay and fight. Create enough chaos that the rest can run." "That's suicide," Jacob said. "It's mathematics," Silas corrected. 40 of them, maybe 15 of us who can fight. We won't win, but we can buy time. We can make them bleed. We can make them remember that slaves fought back, that we weren't property that went quietly." "No," Zara said, her voice carrying absolute authority. "We didn't come this far to throw our lives away on symbolic gestures. We survive. All of us. That's the only victory that matters. Then what do you suggest?" Silas challenged. "Because I don't see a path where all 250 of us walk out of this." The argument continued, voices rising despite the need for silence, and Jacob realized they were fracturing. Fear and exhaustion, and the sheer impossibility of their situation, was tearing apart the fragile unity that had held them together. He was about to speak, about to try to mediate, when a single rifle shot echoed across the canyon. Everyone froze. The shot had come from the north, from one of the outer watch positions. Then came the screaming. They found Marcus, one of the younger scouts, at his post with a bullet through his shoulder. 3 riders had spotted him, chased him down. He'd been lucky they'd wanted him alive for questioning. But his screams had given away the general direction of the caves, and now Vance's forces were converging. How long? Zara asked as Thomas worked to staunch Marcus's bleeding. 20 minutes, Jacob estimated. Maybe less if they push hard. Mama Ezekiel knelt beside Marcus, her scarred hands gentle on his face. "You did good, child. You held on long enough to warn us. That's what matters." But Marcus was crying, not from pain but from shame. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I gave us away. You survived," Mama Ezekiel interrupted firmly. "That's never something to apologize for." Jacob's mind was racing, running through scenarios and rejecting them as fast as they formed. The caves had multiple entrances, but Vance would cover them all. They could try to break through the cordon, but that meant running into armed men on horseback. They could hide deeper in the caves, but that just meant dying slowly from thirst and starvation instead of quickly from bullets. "There's another way out," Zara said suddenly. "Has to be. These caves were carved by water. Water flows downward, finds exits. If we go deep enough, follow the old riverbed, we might find where it emerges." "That's a lot of maybes," Thomas said. "It's more than we had a minute ago," Zara replied. Jacob thought about the deepest chambers, the ones he'd only explored briefly, because they narrowed to the point where even he had to crawl. For someone Zara's size, they'd be nearly impossible. For 250 people, many of them children or elderly, it would be a nightmare journey into darkness with no guarantee of an exit. "Even if there is another way out," he said slowly, "it'll take hours to move everyone through. We'd need time. We'd need a distraction, Silas finished. See, we're back to my plan. Some of us stay and make noise while everyone else escapes. Not everyone, Jacob heard himself say. Just me. The silence that followed was absolute. That's insane, Thomas said finally. It's practical, Jacob corrected. I'm the only white man here. I can walk out, meet them in the open, tell them I haven't seen anyone. I can buy you hours, maybe a full day before they search thoroughly. And when they find evidence of 250 people living in these caves? Zara asked quietly. I'll say I was forced to help, that you held me at gunpoint, that I was a hostage. They'll believe it. White man, former Confederate soldier, they'll want to believe it. And then you'll hang anyway for harboring us, Mama Ezekiel said. Federal law doesn't care about excuses. Maybe, but you'll be gone. That's what matters. Zara grabbed his arm, her grip like iron. No, we don't sacrifice people. That's their logic, their mathematics. We're supposed to be better. I'm not being noble, Jacob said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. I'm being practical. One life to buy 250 lives time to escape. It's the best trade we're going to get. It's not a trade we're willing to make, Zara insisted. Good thing it's not your choice. He pulled away from her grip before she could stop him, already moving toward the cave entrance. Behind him, he could hear arguing, hear people calling his name, but he didn't stop. Stopping meant thinking. Thinking meant recognizing all the reasons this was a terrible idea. The afternoon sun was brutal after the cool darkness of the caves. Jacob walked out into the open, hands visible and empty, moving toward where Vance's riders were converging on the canyon. He got about 200 yards before they spotted him. 6 riders broke off from the main group, rifles raised, surrounding him in seconds with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before. On your knees. One of them shouted. Jacob knelt, hands behind his head, watching as Colonel Vance himself rode up. Up close, Vance was older than Jacob had expected, maybe 50, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and not enough sleep. But his eyes were sharp, and they catalogued everything about Jacob in seconds. Jacob Mercer, Vance said, and Jacob's stomach dropped. Vance knew his name. Used to ride with the 4th Texas Cavalry, if memory serves. Fought at Wilson's Creek and Pea Ridge. Disappeared after Appomattox without mustering out properly. War was over, Jacob said carefully. Didn't see the point in waiting for permission to go home. Except you didn't go home. You went west. Started working cattle in the territories. Living alone. Avoiding towns, avoiding people. Vance dismounted, standing over Jacob with his hand resting casually on his sidearm. A man develops a pattern like that. It makes people curious about what he's running from. Not running from anything. Just prefer solitude. Is that right? Vance smiled, and there was no warmth in it. Then you won't mind explaining why we found tracks of at least 100 people leading to this canyon. Why your camp shows evidence of feeding far more than one man. Why our scout was shot near caves that you, based on your supplies and equipment, have clearly been using for storage. Jacob said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make things worse. Here's what I think, Vance continued. I think you've been harboring fugitive slaves. A lot of them. I think that massive group we've been tracking for 6 weeks is hiding in those caves right now. And I think you're going to tell me exactly where they are and how many we're dealing with. Or I'm going to have my men start a fire at every cave entrance and smoke them out like rats. There's no one in the caves, Jacob said. Just me, just my supplies. You're lying. You're terrible at it, but you're lying. The question is why. Vance studied him with an intensity that felt like being dissected. You fought for the Confederacy. You bled for it. So why are you protecting the very people you fought to keep enslaved? Because I was wrong. Because everything I thought I believed was built on lies and cruelty. Because 250 people in those caves have more courage and humanity than I ever showed during 4 years of war. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he said, they're not property. The war ended that. The 13th Amendment ended that. The 13th Amendment has a very interesting piece of language in it, Vance said. It abolishes slavery except as punishment for crime. And fleeing from lawful ownership before the amendment's ratification, that was a crime, which means these people are legally criminal slaves, and I have every right to recover them. That's not what the law says. It's what the law can be interpreted to say. An interpretation is everything in the territories where there's no judges and no courts to argue in. Out here, the law is what men like me say it is. Jacob understood then that there would be no reasoning with Vance, no appealing to mercy or morality. The man had built a business on suffering, had found a way to profit from pain, and he'd defend that business with the same ferocity any merchant defended their livelihood. I'll ask you one more time, Vance said quietly. Where are they? Before Jacob could answer, a sound echoed across the canyon. A woman's voice, powerful and clear, singing. The words were unfamiliar, African maybe, or something older, but the meaning was clear in the melody itself. It was a warning, a goodbye, a promise. Zara was singing. Vance smiled. Well, that answers that question. He turned to his men. Secure this one. Then we go in and round them up. Remember, they're valuable property. Try not to damage them more than necessary. 2 riders grabbed Jacob, binding his hands with practiced efficiency. He didn't resist. Couldn't resist. All he could do was watch as Vance's force moved toward the cave entrances, and hope that Zara had gotten everyone moving toward whatever exit she'd hoped existed in the depths. The singing continued, echoing off the canyon walls, and Jacob recognized it now for what it was. Not a goodbye, a distraction. Zara was drawing them in, making them think the refugees were still in the outer chambers, while the real escape happened deeper in the darkness. She was doing exactly what he'd tried to do, sacrificing herself to buy time for the others. Colonel, one of the riders called out, there's someone at the main entrance. Biggest person I've ever seen. Vance's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or anticipation. The breeding farm giant. Worth $1,000 on her own. He turned to Jacob. Looks like you've been harboring quite the collection of valuable property, Mr. Mercer. When we're done here, we'll discuss your sentencing. Federal prison, most likely. They've got nice cells waiting for traders who aid escaped slaves. Better than living knowing I helped you, Jacob said. Vance hit him. Not hard, just enough to make a point. Such moral superiority from a man who helped burn Georgia. You think I don't know about that? You think I don't know exactly what you did during the war? We're the same, Mercer. We just picked different lies to tell ourselves about it afterward. Maybe he was right. Maybe there was no difference between burning a plantation full of celebrating slaves and dragging escaped slaves back to bondage. Maybe all of it was just different flavors of cruelty, different ways of destroying people while telling yourself it was necessary. But watching Vance's men surround the cave entrance, watching them prepare to capture people whose only crime was wanting to be free, Jacob understood one critical difference. He could still choose to be better. Could still choose, even now, even bound and beaten, to do one good thing that might matter. Zara. He shouted, his voice cracking with effort. He knows. They all know. Run. The blow this time was harder, dropping him to his knees. His vision swam, blood filling his mouth where his teeth had cut his cheek. But he'd done it. He'd warned her. Whatever happened next, he'd at least done that. Vance stood over him, disappointment on his face, like a parent scolding a child. That was foolish. They can't run. There's nowhere to run to. All you did was make this harder for everyone. But Jacob saw something Vance didn't. Movement at the canyon's far end, where the ancient river had once flowed. Small figures emerging, running low, spreading out across the scrubland. Not 250 people. Maybe 50, maybe less. The children, the pregnant women, the elderly, the ones who needed the most time to escape. Zira had gotten them out, had found the exit, had organized the escape, had put the most vulnerable first, just like she'd done everything else. And now she was staying behind, singing her defiant song, making sure Vance's forces stayed focused on the caves while the people who needed protection ran for freedom. Go in, Vance ordered. Secure the entrances. Anyone who resists, shoot to wound. They're no good to us dead. 20 men moved into the caves, torches held high, guns ready. Jacob waited for the screams, for the chaos of capture. Instead, he heard confusion, shouting, men calling to each other in voices that carried bewilderment instead of triumph. Colonel, one of them emerged, his face pale. They're gone. All of them. There's evidence of recent occupation, but the caves are empty. That's impossible, Vance said flatly. There's only 3 entrances, and we had them all watched. Then they found a 4th, the man replied. Because there's no one in there except one woman, and she's... He paused, struggling for words. She's just standing there, singing, waiting. Vance's face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling on cold fury. He turned to survey the horizon, eyes scanning for any sign of movement, and Jacob knew the exact moment he spotted the distant figures fleeing south. Half of you, pursue those runners. Vance ordered. The rest, bring me the woman. And someone shut her up. I'm tired of that damned singing. They brought Zira out in chains. It took 4 men to restrain her, and even then she moved with dignity, her head high, that song still on her lips. When she saw Jacob kneeling in the dirt, bloody and bound, something flickered across her face. Not regret. Not quite. Something harder to name. Understanding, maybe. Recognition that they'd both made the same choice, just in different ways. The famous breeding farm giant, Vance said, circling her like a buyer inspecting livestock. You've led us on quite a chase. Killed 3 men during your escape. Inspired dozens of others to run. Cost your owners tens of thousands of dollars. You should be proud. You've caused more trouble than any single piece of property I've ever hunted. Zara stopped singing. In the sudden silence, her voice was clear and steady. I'm not property. I'm a person. And you can chain me, you can drag me back, you can kill me. But you can't make me property again. That's the thing you people never understood. Ownership isn't something you enforce with chains. It's something the owned person accepts. And I don't. I never will. So take your chains and your laws and your mathematics of suffering, and know that they're empty. Know that you've lost even when you think you've won. Vance stared at her for a long moment. Then he backhanded her across the face hard enough to split her lip. Put her in the wagon. Full restraints. She's worth too much to risk another escape. As they dragged her away, Zara looked back at Jacob one last time. Her expression said everything words couldn't. Thank you. I'm sorry. This isn't over. Then she was gone, loaded into a reinforced wagon designed specifically for transporting dangerous property. And Jacob was alone with Vance and the riders who'd remained behind. Well, Vance said conversationally, that's about half the recovery done. We'll catch the runners before nightfall. They're on foot, exhausted, most of them untrained in wilderness survival. It'll be like collecting scattered sheep." He turned to Jacob. "As for you, I could have you hanged. Probably should. But I think prison is worse. 20 years in a federal cell, watching the world move on without you, knowing you threw your life away for people who'd forget you in a week. That seems more appropriate somehow." Jacob didn't respond. Couldn't. His whole body hurt, and his mind was numb with the knowledge that he'd failed. That despite everything, despite the sacrifice and the planning and the desperate hope, Vance had won. Then, from the south, a sound that made everyone freeze. Gunfire. Sustained, rhythmic, professional. The sound of a battle, not a pursuit. Vance's head snapped around, and Jacob saw real confusion cross his face for the first time. That's impossible. They weren't armed. They couldn't. A rider appeared on the horizon, galloping hard, and even from a distance, Jacob could see the panic in his body language. He was running from something, not chasing toward it. "Colonel," the rider screamed as he got closer. "We need to pull back. There's an armed force. At least 50 men, maybe more, with rifles," and he never finished. A rifle shot took him from his saddle, and he hit the ground and didn't move. From the south, figures appeared. Men on horseback, moving in formation, rifles ready. But they weren't slave catchers. They weren't bounty hunters. They were black. Every single one of them. Armed, organized, and moving with the precision of trained cavalry. And at their head, riding a gray horse, like it was born to carry her, was Zira. She'd escaped. Somehow, impossibly, she'd gotten free during the transport. And she hadn't run. She'd come back with an army. Asterisk, the riders came on in perfect formation, 53 strong, and as they drew closer, Jacob could see details that made his breath catch. These weren't escaped slaves playing at soldiers. These were veterans. Men who'd fought in the war, who'd served in the United States colored troops, who'd learned warfare the hard way and survived to practice it with deadly precision, and leading them, somehow freed from chains that should have held her, was Zira. She'd acquired a rifle from somewhere, and she carried it with the ease of someone who knew its weight and reach. Defensive positions. Vance shouted, his voice cutting through the shock that had paralyzed his men. "Form a line. You'll prepare to do nothing," Zara called out, her voice carrying across the distance with that same impossible clarity. "Except listen, because I'm about to explain how this ends, and you're going to want to hear every word." She rode forward alone, stopping 50 yards from Vance's position. Close enough to talk, far enough to avoid immediate danger. The men behind her maintained their formation, rifles ready but not aimed, a clear statement of controlled force. "How did you," Vance started, "escape your wagon?" It was built for intimidating slaves, not containing soldiers. Your men weren't expecting resistance from someone they'd already mentally categorized as property. They were wrong. She shifted in her saddle, and Jacob noticed blood on her sleeve. She'd been wounded in the escape, but her face showed no pain. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is who these men are and why they're here. "Escaped slaves," Vance said, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Armed illegally. Subject to immediate recapture. Veterans," Sarah corrected, "of the 62nd United States Colored Infantry Regiment. Honorably discharged. Legal citizens with every right to bear arms and travel freely. Men who heard about a situation developing out here and decided to investigate." She smiled, and it was sharp as broken glass. "Men who fought for the Union, for freedom, who aren't particularly sympathetic to former. Confederate officers running slave hunting operations in territories where the legal status of such operations is questionable. One of the riders moved forward, an older man with sergeant's stripes still visible on his dusty coat. His face was weathered, his eyes hard, and he carried himself with the authority of someone who'd commanded men in life-or-death situations. "Colonel Vance," the sergeant said, his voice clipped and professional. "I'm Sergeant Major Augustus Freeman, formerly of the 62nd USCT, currently operating as a private citizen. We've been tracking your operation for 3 weeks. We know you've been interpreting post-war fugitive slave law in ways that directly contradict federal guidelines. We know you've been capturing free black citizens and selling them back into bondage. We know you've killed 17 people during your recovery operations this year alone. That's military business. You're not military anymore," Freeman interrupted. "You're a private contractor operating in legal gray areas, which means you have no special authority, no special protections. You're just a man with guns and bad intentions, and we're men with guns and better lawyers." Vance looked between Zira and Freeman, his face going through calculations Jacob recognized from the war. Tactical assessments, casualty estimates, the mathematics of violence. Finally, he spoke, and his voice had changed, gone flat and professional. "You're outnumbered. I have 40 men to your 50, but you're divided. Some of your force is chasing the runners, which leaves you with maybe 30 here. We could take you. You could try," Freeman agreed. "Some of us would die. More of you would die. And at the end, federal authorities would investigate what happened out here, and they'd find a former Confederate officer leading a force that killed honorably discharged Union veterans. How do you think that trial goes, Colonel? How do you think history remembers you?" The silence that followed was broken only by the wind moving across the scrubland. Jacob watched Vance's face, saw the moment the calculation finished, saw him reach a conclusion he clearly hated. "What do you want?" "The refugees go free," Zara said simply. "All of them. You withdraw your forces, report that the trail went cold, and never pursue any of these specific individuals again. That's thousands of dollars in lost bounties. My clients will find other property to chase," Freeman interrupted. "The territories are full of escaped slaves. You'll have plenty of work. Just not here. Not these people. Not today. And what about him?" Vance gestured to Jacob, still bound and bleeding in the dirt. "He broke federal law. Harbored fugitives. That's a crime regardless of politics or sympathy." Zara's eyes met Jacob's, and in them he saw something that made his chest tight. Respect, maybe, or recognition of shared sacrifice. "He was my hostage," Zara said, the lie smooth as river stones. "I held him at gunpoint, forced him to provide supplies and shelter. He's a victim, not a criminal. Any testimony saying otherwise would be from your men, who just tried to recapture legally ambiguous fugitives in violation of federal Reconstruction guidelines. I don't think their testimony carries much weight." Vance stared at her, at Freeman, at the assembled riders who'd positioned themselves with clear tactical superiority. Finally, he nodded once, sharp and bitter. "Cut him loose." The ropes fell away from Jacob's wrists, and he struggled to his feet, his legs barely holding him. One of Freeman's men rode forward, offering a hand onto the horse. Jacob took it, too exhausted to do anything but accept help. "This isn't over," Vance said quietly. The law is changing," Freeman interrupted. "Every day, it changes a little more. Every day, men like you have a little less ground to stand on. Eventually, you'll wake up and find the world has moved on without you, and everything you built your life on has become history's shameful footnote. I suggest you find a new profession before that happens." Vance's forces withdrew slowly, maintaining formation, keeping weapons ready, but not engaging. It was a professional retreat, the kind Jacob had seen 100 times during the war. Not surrender, exactly. Just recognition that this particular battle wasn't worth the cost. When they were finally gone, disappeared beyond the horizon, Zara dismounted and walked over to where Jacob sat slumped in the saddle. Up close, he could see how much the escape had cost her. Blood on her clothes, fresh bruises darkening her skin, exhaustion in every line of her body. How? He managed to ask. The wagon had a weakness in the floor. I kicked through it while they were moving, dropped out underneath, rolled into a gully. They didn't notice for almost a mile. She touched her side, wincing. Broke 2 ribs doing it, but it worked. And them? Jacob gestured to Freeman and his men. We sent word ahead weeks ago, when we first started running. Asked for help from any veteran units that might be willing. The 62nd was stationed near Fort Bliss. When they got our message, 53 men volunteered to ride out, unpaid, to help people they'd never met. She paused. Turns out freedom means something to men who fought for it. Freeman joined them, his expression unreadable. The rest of your people are about 5 miles south, hiding in an arroyo. My scouts found them, explained the situation. They're waiting for word that it's safe. It's safe? Zara asked. For now. Vance won't come back, at least not immediately. He's too smart to push after losing this round. But you need to move fast. Get across the border into New Mexico territory by tomorrow night. After that, you'll be under different jurisdictional rules. And Vance's pursuit authority gets even murkier. We can make it, Zara said, though her voice carried exhaustion that contradicted the confidence. You'll have help. Freeman gestured to his men. 20 of us will escort you to the border. The rest will stay here. Make sure Vance's forces don't double back. Once you're across, you'll be on your own. But at least you'll have a head start. The reunion of the scattered refugees happened at sunset, in a shallow canyon where water pooled and cottonwoods provided shade. Jacob watched as families found each other, as parents clutched children they'd thought lost, as the community that had fractured under pressure reformed itself stronger than before. Mama Ezekiel found him sitting alone, trying to clean the blood from his face with water from his canteen. She didn't say anything, just took the canteen from him and worked with gentle efficiency. Her scarred hands surprisingly tender. You didn't have to do what you did, she said finally. Yes, I did. Why? We're nothing to you. Strangers. Problems you didn't ask for. Jacob thought about that. About the burning plantation in Georgia. About the faces of 40 people celebrating freedom while he prepared to destroy everything they needed to survive. About 4 years of fighting for a cause he'd never truly examined until it was too late. Because I needed to be someone different than who I was, he said. Because doing nothing would have made me complicit. Because ... He paused, searching for words. Because you deserve better than a world where men like me stood by and watched, while people like Vance destroyed lives for profit. Mama Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment. Then, you know we're probably all going to die anyway, right? Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. But the odds of 250 escaped slaves surviving in the territories, even with a head start, they're not good. I know. So why bother? Why sacrifice everything for a cause that's probably doomed? Because probably doomed isn't certainly doomed. Because every day you're free is a day you chose for yourself. Because he met her eyes. Because the alternative is accepting that Vance is right. That people are property. That suffering is just the cost of business. And I can't live in that world anymore. She nodded slowly, then pressed something into his hand. A small carved figure, roughly made but recognizable as a woman with her arms raised to the sky. My youngest daughter made this for me before they sold her. She was 6. I kept it through 20 years of hell, hoping I'd see her again. I never did. Never will. She closed his fingers around it. But she made it as a symbol of hope, of survival. And now I'm giving it to you, because you need to understand something. You saved us today. Maybe we die tomorrow. Maybe we all get caught next week. But today, right now, 250 people are free because you chose to be better than your past. That matters. That will always matter, no matter what comes next. The truth of it hit Jacob like a physical force, and he found himself crying for the first time since the war ended. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere he'd locked away years ago. Mama Ezekiel held him while he broke, her arms surprisingly strong. Her voice murmuring words he couldn't quite hear, but felt in his bones. When he finally stopped, emptied out, she patted his shoulder and stood. Come on. We're having a celebration. A celebration? We're alive and free. That's always worth celebrating, especially when you don't know how long it'll last. The celebration was unlike anything Jacob had ever experienced. No alcohol, no excess, just people sitting around small fires, sharing what little food they had, telling stories and singing songs that carried both sorrow and joy in equal measure. The children played quiet games, their laughter carefully muted but genuine. The old folks shared memories of people and places lost. The young men and women talked about futures they were only beginning to imagine. Zerah found Jacob near midnight, sitting alone at the edge of the gathering. She lowered herself to the ground beside him, with a grimace that spoke to her cracked ribs, and for a while they just sat in companionable silence. What will you do now? She asked finally. I don't know. Can't go back to my camp. Vance knows who I am now. He'll make sure I'm blacklisted from any cattle work in the territories. Might pursue federal charges anyway, though Freeman's testimony should complicate that. You could come with us. Jacob looked at her sharply. What? Come with us? We're heading to New Mexico, maybe Colorado after that. There's towns up there, new settlements where people care less about where you came from and more about what you can do. A man with your skills, your experience. We could use you. She paused. I could use you. The offer hung in the air between them, tempting in ways Jacob hadn't expected. A community, a purpose, a chance to build something instead of running from something. But he could already see the complications. The ways his presence would draw attention, would mark the group as suspicious, would potentially endanger the very people he tried to save. I'd make you more visible, he said quietly. One white man traveling with 250 black refugees? That's a story people remember, talk about, report to authorities. You're better off without me. Maybe, Sarah agreed. Or maybe having one white man vouching for us, explaining we're free citizens moving west, makes us less suspicious than being a large group with no white witnesses. Either way, it's your choice. But know the offer stands. Where will you go? Eventually? Canada, probably. Like Ruth said, it's the only place we're truly safe from slave catchers and legal ambiguities. It'll take months, maybe years. But we'll get there. She looked at him with those impossible eyes. You could come all the way. See the journey through. Jacob thought about that. About walking away from everything he'd known, everyone he'd been. About joining a community built on the ruins of bondage, helping them build something new from the ashes of the old. About finally, truly, choosing a side instead of hiding in neutrality. I'll come as far as New Mexico, he said finally. Help you get settled. After that, I don't know, but I'll see you that far at least. Zara smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it reached her eyes. That's enough. That's more than enough. The journey to New Mexico took 6 days, moving only at night, using routes Freeman's scouts had mapped out. 20 veterans rode escort, their presence transforming the desperate flight into something that resembled an actual military operation. They moved with discipline, posted guards, maintained formation. More than once, they encountered other travelers or distant settlements. And each time Freeman's credentials and professional demeanor convinced potential problems to become non-issues. On the fifth night, as they camped in a canyon where ancient peoples had left paintings on the rock walls, Thomas found Jacob checking his rifle. The carpenter sat down beside him, his movements careful and deliberate. "You know we're going to tell this story, right?" Thomas said. "What you did. What happened here. It's going to become part of our history, our collective memory. The white man who chose conscience over safety. I'd prefer you didn't," Jacob said. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who finally did one decent thing after years of doing terrible ones. That doesn't balance the scales. Maybe not, but it shows the scales can move, that people can change. That's important for the children to know, that the world isn't fixed in place, that cruelty isn't inevitable." Thomas paused. "My wife and children, the ones sold away, they're probably still enslaved somewhere. Maybe in Texas, maybe Louisiana, maybe dead. I'll probably never find them, never see them again. But knowing there are people like you, people who'll help even when it costs them everything, ... that makes me think someone might help them someday. That maybe they'll find their own Jacob Mercer when they need one." "I hope they do," Jacob said quietly. "I hope they find someone better than me." They crossed into New Mexico territory on the seventh day, finding a small settlement called Corazon that Freeman's contacts had identified as sympathetic to refugees. It was a mixed community, Mexican and American, with a significant population of free black citizens who'd moved west after the war. The town's leader, a former Buffalo soldier named Captain Washington, welcomed them with cautious efficiency. "You can stay here for a few weeks," Washington said, addressing Zara and Freeman in his small office. "Rest, resupply, figure out your next move. But you can't stay permanently. We don't have resources for 250 new people, and your presence will eventually draw attention we can't afford." "We understand," Zara said. "We just need time to organize, to plan the next leg of the journey." "Where are you ultimately headed?" "Canada." Washington nodded slowly. "Long road, but possible. There's networks, people who help with these journeys. I can put you in touch with some of them." He paused, looking at Jacob. "And you?" Jacob started, then stopped. He'd been about to say he was leaving, going back to solitude, finding another empty place to disappear into. But looking at Zara, at the exhausted determination on her face, he found himself saying something different. "I'm going with them, far as they'll let me." Over the next 3 weeks, as the refugees rested and regrouped in Corazon, Jacob watched them transform. The fear that had driven them began to evolve into something else. Not quite confidence, but determination. They'd survived the impossible, had faced down armed men and lived. That changed people, gave them a kind of strength that couldn't be taken away. Families began making plans. Some decided to stay in New Mexico, find work in the settlements scattered across the territory. Others committed to the journey north, to Canada and true freedom. The group that had been 250 strong began fragmenting naturally, not from fear, but from choice. People deciding their own paths, making their own futures. Silas, the young man with the burned face, came to find Jacob on the last day before the northbound group departed. "I'm staying here," he said without preamble. "Captain Washington offered me work as a deputy. Says he needs men who aren't afraid of violence, who know how to stand up to bad people." "That's good," Jacob said. "You'll be good at it. Maybe. Or maybe I'll become the thing I hate. But I have to try." He paused, struggling with words. You taught me something, back at the caves, when you offered to surrender yourself to buy us time. You taught me that sacrifice doesn't have to be death, that sometimes the bravest thing is living with consequences instead of dying to avoid them. I didn't teach you anything you didn't already know. Maybe, but I needed to see someone else do it first. Needed proof it was possible. Silas extended his hand. Thank you. For everything? They shook, and Jacob felt the strength in Silas's grip, the determination. This young man would probably make a good deputy. Might even make a difference in ways Jacob never could. Mama Ezekiel was staying too, she told him the next morning. Too old for a journey to Canada. Too tired. But here I can rest. Can spend my final years free, watching children play without fear, eating at tables where I'm treated as human. That's enough. That's more than I dreamed possible. One by one, the refugees made their choices. In the end, only 89 committed to the final push north to Canada. The strongest, the youngest, those with the least to lose and everything to gain from true, legal freedom beyond America's borders. Zara led them, of course. No one questioned that. She'd brought them this far, and they'd follow her the rest of the way. Freeman and 12 of his veterans volunteered to escort them through the dangerous middle stretch, through Colorado, where pro-slavery sympathizers still operated openly. On the morning of departure, Jacob packed his meager belongings and prepared to ride out with them. He'd made his choice, for better or worse. He'd see this through to the end. But Mama Ezekiel stopped him at the edge of town, her hand on his horse's bridle. You don't have to go, she said quietly. You've done enough. More than enough. You could stay here, build a life, maybe find some peace finally. I need to see them safe, Jacob said. Need to know the story has an ending. All stories have endings. Not all of them are happy. You prepared for that? No, he admitted. But I'm going anyway. She nodded, like she'd expected that answer. Then carry this forward. She pressed the small carved figure back into his hand, the one her daughter had made. Not for luck, not for protection, just as a reminder that hope survives even when everything else dies. That people make beautiful things even in darkness. That freedom is worth any price, even if we don't live long enough to enjoy it fully. The journey north took 4 months. 4 months of careful travel, of avoiding towns and patrols, of moving through the empty spaces where America's laws didn't quite reach. They lost 3 people along the way. An elderly man whose heart gave out in the Colorado mountains. A woman who caught fever and didn't recover. A child who fell from a cliff during a night crossing. Each lost carved pieces from the group's spirit, but they kept moving because stopping meant dying. Moving meant hope. Jacob kept expecting to wake up one morning and find himself alone. The refugees vanished like a dream. But every day they were there, real and determined, and more alive than anyone he'd met during the war. They taught him songs he'd never heard, told him stories from cultures he'd never encountered, showed him that the America he'd thought he knew was just one small piece of a much larger, more complex country. Zara and Jacob grew close during those months. Not romantically. That particular bridge was impossible to cross, given everything between them, but as comrades. As people who'd seen each other at worst moments and best, who'd chosen courage when retreat was easier, who'd committed to a cause that might destroy them. You know this might all be for nothing, she said one night, as they camped in the foothills of the Canadian Rockies. The border less than a week's travel ahead. We might get to Canada and find it's just as bad. Might find that freedom is just another lie told to desperate people. Maybe, Jacob agreed. But you'll have tried. You'll have done everything possible to claim something better. That has to count for something, does it? In the final accounting, Does effort matter if you fail? I don't know. But I know giving up guarantees failure. Trying at least gives you a chance. She smiled in the darkness. When did you become optimistic? I'm not optimistic. I'm just less certain that everything is hopeless. That's not the same thing. They crossed into Canada on a gray morning in late November, walking across an invisible line that separated one country from another, one set of laws from another, one future from another. There was no ceremony, no official welcome, just a surveyor's marker, and the knowledge that on this side of the line, they were legally, irrevocably free. 86 people made it to that line. 86 souls who'd traveled almost 1,000 miles, who'd survived everything the world had thrown at them, who'd chosen freedom over safety at every turn. They settled in a small community outside Toronto, joining other refugees who'd made similar journeys. Jacob helped them build, helped them establish themselves, helped them navigate the complicated process of becoming Canadian citizens. He stayed for 6 months, watching them transform from desperate refugees into a community with its own identity, its own strength. Then, on a spring morning when the world felt new and possible, he prepared to leave. Zira found him packing his few belongings, her expression unreadable. You're really going? I am. Back to America? No, not there. Maybe California. Maybe somewhere else entirely. But somewhere I can build something instead of running from something. You built something here. I helped. But this is your community, your story. Mine is still waiting to be written. She pulled him into a hug that nearly cracked his ribs, her impossible strength obvious even in a gesture of affection. Thank you, she said simply, for everything, for the water, for the sacrifice, for seeing us as human when the world said we were property. Thank you for reminding me I could still choose to be better than my past. As Jacob rode away from the community, heading west toward whatever came next, he thought about Thomas's words from months ago, about how this story would be told, passed down, become part of the collective memory of survival and resistance. He hoped Thomas was right, hoped that somewhere, in some future he'd never see, people would hear about the cowboy who gave water to a giant escaped slave girl, and the 250 people who surrounded his camp, and the choice he made when choices mattered most, not because he was a hero. He wasn't. He'd been a soldier for the wrong side, a man who'd committed atrocities in service of a lie, someone who'd spent years running from his own conscience. But in the end, when the moment came, he'd chosen humanity over law, chosen conscience over safety, chosen to help instead of harm. Maybe that was enough. Maybe in a world built on cruelty and suffering, one moment of choosing better was all anyone could ask for. Maybe salvation wasn't about erasing the past, but about deciding who you'd be in the present. Maybe redemption wasn't a destination, but a direction, a commitment to keep choosing better, even when better was hard. Jacob never saw Zara again. But for the rest of his life, which lasted another 37 years, he carried that small carved figure Mama Ezekiel had given him, carried it through California gold fields and Colorado silver mines, through a second marriage and the children that came from it, through all the years of building a life worth living. When people asked about it, about the crude carving of a woman with her arms raised to the sky, he'd tell them the story, the real story, not sanitized, not simplified, the story of 250 people who chose freedom over bondage, who walked 1,000 miles through hell, who survived because they refused to accept that suffering was inevitable. The story of a woman who was born into bondage, bred like livestock, who escaped and became something the world had tried to prevent a person in full, claiming her own destiny. And yes, he'd tell them about his part, not because he thought he was special, but because he wanted them to understand that choosing better was always possible. that the past didn't define the future, that even men who'd done terrible things could find moments to do good things, and those moments mattered. The world moved on. Slavery was abolished. Reconstruction came and went. The territories became states. The survivors of bondage built communities and families and futures that their owners had tried to deny them. History remembered some names and forgot others. But in small communities across Canada, in stories passed from generation to generation, the tale of the impossible journey survived. If you've stayed with this story through all its darkness, through moments that showed humanity at its worst and its best, then you understand something important. You understand that history isn't just dates and battles and famous names. It's individual choices made by people facing impossible situations. It's the moment when someone decides whether to pass by or stop and help, whether to stay silent or speak up, whether to maintain comfort or risk everything for conscience. These are the kinds of stories we explore here at the Sealed Room. Narratives that have been buried or forgotten. Moments when ordinary people made extraordinary choices that rippled through history in ways they never lived to see. If these stories matter to you, if you believe in preserving the uncomfortable truths that make us better, then subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Let them know that even in darkness, people found ways to be light. Sarah lived another 43 years. She married, had children who grew to normal heights, became a community leader in Toronto's Black settlement. She never forgot the journey, never stopped telling the story, never let her children or grandchildren forget the price that freedom carried. When she died in 1909, at the age of 77, over 300 people attended her funeral. Many of them were descendants of the 86 who'd made it to Canada. Children and grandchildren of people who'd chosen freedom when freedom was a crime. Her last words, according to her daughter, were about water. About a cowboy in Texas who'd given her water when he could have turned her away. About how that one small act of mercy had somehow grown into a movement, into salvation, into a community that survived and thrived against every odd. Never underestimate kindness, she'd whispered. Never think your choices don't matter. The water he gave me kept me alive long enough to save 250 people. And they've had children, and those children have had children. And now there are thousands of us living free because one man decided that giving water to a desperate stranger was more important than protecting himself. She was right. By the time of her death, those 86 refugees had become a community of over 1,000 people. Farmers and teachers and merchants and craftsmen. People who lived freely, who voted, who owned property, who raised children, who'd never know the weight of chains. All of it traced back to that moment in a Texas scrubland when a cowboy gave water to an impossible woman, and both of them chose to be better than the world expected. That's the legacy of courage. Not monuments or fame or recognition, just the quiet accumulation of lives lived freely, of children born into hope instead of bondage, of futures that were chosen instead of assigned. That's what Jacob Mercer and Zira created in those desperate weeks. Not a perfect ending. Those don't exist, but a possible one. A better one. An ending where people survived and built and became more than the world wanted them to be. And maybe that's enough. Maybe in a nation built on the backs of enslaved people, in a history soaked in blood and cruelty, moments of choosing humanity over law, conscience over comfort, are all we can ask for. Maybe redemption isn't erasing the past, but choosing, again and again, to build a better future from its ruins. Somewhere in Canada, Zara's great-great-grandchildren still tell this story. They've embellished it, probably added details that didn't exist, turned real people into legends. But the core remains true. A woman who refused to be property, a man who chose conscience over safety, and 250 people who walked 1,000 miles to claim their own destinies. That truth survives. Even when everything else fades, even when names are forgotten and details blur, that truth remains. People fought for freedom. Some succeeded. All of them mattered. And on a dusty shelf in a house in Northern California, in a glass case next to faded photographs and old letters, sits a small carved figure. A woman with her arms raised to the sky. Created by a 6-year-old girl who was sold away from her mother. Carried by that mother through 20 years of bondage. Given to a cowboy who'd spent years running from his conscience. Passed down through generations as a reminder that hope survives even when everything else dies. That freedom is worth any price. That choosing better is always possible. That one act of kindness, one moment of courage, one decision to help instead of harm, can ripple through history in ways we'll never live to see, but will matter forever.